Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Ruy Texeira, who is an American political scientist and commentator and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and author of 6 books, focusing largely on electoral demographics, but I'm sure a number of other themes. Ruy, I've been chasing you for a while, sent a few emails through your website. That's always a bit of a crapshoot. But finally, you appeared on the Power Hungry podcast with my good friend Robert Bryce, and he made the introduction. So it's wonderful to be acquainted and great to meet you virtually like this. Welcome to Decouple.
Thank you for having me, Chris, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm a big fan of what you've been up to and of your podcast.
Oh, I appreciate that. So, Ruy, I initially came across your work. You published an article in 2020. I forget in what publication, but it was called "The 5 Deadly Sins of the Left," and that was actually just when I started this podcast. And the podcast itself, I mean, I come from a pretty solidly radical left background, to be quite honest. I was on my first picket line at the tender age of 11 or 12, getting almost run over by some scab labor. I just come from a bit of a lefty family, very much grew up in a bit of a hippie town here in Southern Ontario. I think at the root of this podcast experience and my sort of exploration or re-exploration of my politics was this idea that you could have the correct politics, maybe that sort of left-wing platform, and we'll talk about maybe what that is, because it's so much has changed from sort of the old left to the new left. And I'm eager to deep dive that with you. But you could have your wish list of progressive left-wing politics, but you could have politicians who just do not have an understanding of the built world, who deploy the wrong technological solutions and completely screw up things like an energy transition. And I think that's kind of what I'm starting to see. So that really caused me to question some of my political beliefs. And although I experienced some cognitive dissonance reading that article initially, I think it was a real clarion call for the left to potentially find itself and become relevant again. Whether or not that is happening or has a hope of happening, maybe we'll explore a bit today. I think central to what I've been thinking about recently, in order to try and explain the lack of engineering discipline on the left, and I made a little 5-line tweet about this, but was this idea that the left has become completely alienated from production, from the built world, as a result from shifting its loyalties and base from labor to the student vanguard, potentially moving into academia. But again, I am no expert in this field, and excited to have a bona fide political scientist on to help me understand this further. So what motivated you to write the 5 Deadly Sins article, and we'll break it down a little bit as maybe the architecture and structure of this interview.
Well, what motivated me to write it, I suppose, is kind of connects to what you were alluding to about your background, how you were a radical leftist, and you sort of were oriented toward the working class and toward the disadvantaged and toward what could help lift people up, and perhaps currently existing capitalist society wasn't doing such a great job and we could do a lot better. And that's certainly my background as someone coming out of the radical left. I was actually, I don't know about you, Chris, but I was actually a member of a Marxist-Leninist organization for a while when I was a youth. So I was talking the talk and walking the walk back in the day. So, I evolved over time to have much more pragmatic politics. The revolution wasn't coming, and I became what I still think of today, a class-oriented social democrat. I have observed over time that the version of the left we have in the Democratic Party, but I think this is true across the Western world, the parties of the left have become increasingly oriented away from class and toward a series of other concerns that are sociocultural, identitarian in nature, and among which I would include climate at this point, and we'll probably talk about that. And that the views and preferences of the liberal college-educated who have increasingly migrated into the parties of the left with their influence, with their money, with their preferences, have in a sense taken over the brand of the left in most advanced countries. And that's certainly the case for the Democratic Party in the United States. It's not like they don't do anything that has to do with helping the disadvantaged. But in terms of the salience, the commitments they have and the salience those commitments have to them, and the way it influences the party brand and priorities, I mean, there's an enormous influence, a big change. I mean, you can see it, sort of in an ever ascending arc from the 90s through today. And of course, we had the turbocharged uh, George Floyd summer in 2020 that really brought a lot of this to the head. And it was about that time, a little after that, I guess I wrote my Five Deadly Sins of the Left piece for the American Compass, which is a very interesting American heterodox center-right group. I just felt I had to speak out. I mean, this is this isn't what I signed up for. I mean, I believe in helping. The people in the working and middle class, and I think the what's always been good about social democrats is they believe the government has a role to play in dealing with those inequalities and sort of driving an economic model that will potentially benefit the largest number of people, and the government has a big role to play in that if it does if it sort of has reasonably efficient and effective plans, and that's what it should concentrate on. And in terms of social issues, I mean, I think it's been clear the left has always been for anti-discrimination, tolerance, and in that sense, promoting diversity, but that to put identitarian concerns first and foremost in the priorities of the left was a big mistake, and it was taking it away from a lot of the things it needed to stand for and to accomplish, to be universalist, to promote economic growth, to promote technical progress, to promote prosperity for everybody, right? I mean, what people really want is to be prosperous. They don't want to signal their commitment to social justice or pat themselves on the back about how terrific they are in moral terms. That the median voter wants in the U.S. and Canada and other places is a better life. And when the left loses sight of its commitment to give the maximum number of people a better life, a prosperous life, to, as it were, enrich themselves, I think it loses its way. And its priorities become skewed, and its political effectiveness is undermined, and we get some pretty bad outcomes.
I mean, it's curious that this article is published in the American Compass. I think I'm not as familiar with U.S. institutions, excuse me, and media, but it seems like some of the most interesting conversations are happening in these potentially center-right or these more heterodox spaces, as you described them. We'll go through again in more detail those five deadly sins, but probably I think you could add a sixth one, which just has to do with sort of cloistered discourse on the left these days. The cancel culture, which is so prevalent, this idea of sort of only reading within the strict canon of the left. I imagine some people would say, well, I'm not even going to read that article in the American Compass because it's a right-wing, outlet which has platformed X, Y, and Z person. Therefore, we must strike everything that's ever been written from that from even consideration. So, I mean, do you agree that that's potentially a sixth sin, or just tell me a little bit about your assessment of the left's ability to even kind of self-analyze, given some of the constraints it puts on discourse?
Yeah, no, I refer to this as using a phrase that became popular in the early 2000s on the American left to talk about the right. They talked about epistemic closure on the right. Well, I think we now have the analogous phenomenon on the left, epistemic closure on the left, where you can only think and talk about and have a discourse concerning a pretty narrow range of acceptable opinions and acceptable reference and acceptable sources, right? And if you go outside of those bounds, you are like playing for the other team, and what you are saying and alluding to must be completely wrong, false, or at worst, you're basically a tool of the fascists. I mean, right? So this is really quite extraordinary. The left historically has stood for the widest possible remit in terms of trying to understand the way the world works, and it has a pretty absolutist commitment to free speech, and was not typically in the business, unless you were a Stalinist, I suppose, of policing discourse that vigorously. But it's happened today. And that's one thing that drove me out of the conventional left in the United States. I worked for the Center for American Progress for many years, and that's the sort of biggest center-left Democratic Party-oriented think tank. And over time, I realized that as much as I would try to make arguments about how you should pay more attention to what the median working class voter thinks, the fact that white working class voters hate the Democratic Party is a real problem. We should keep first and foremost the standard left commitments of, economic progress and uplift, and we shouldn't get too involved in these identitarian concerns, especially since this is a good way of alienating working class voters. And even some of the things that people are now talking about are like basically not good ideas on any measure. Like the really rapid transition toward renewables is probably not a good idea. Having surgery and medications available for transgender kids is probably not a good idea. Being lax on crime is probably not a good idea. Having open borders on the southern border is probably not a good idea. Lots of things are not good ideas, but this gets back to the epistemic closure point. If you reach a point where you can't talk about these issues and raise critical points without essentially being categorized as being on the right, a tool of the right, then it's hard to make progress on these issues. It's hard to form a coherent political and policy strategy when your range of acceptable discourse is so narrow. So I think that's a huge problem. Every one of the deadly sins that that I identified in the article and you read about are essentially, there's this overarching problem that drives those deadly sins to some extent, and it is this epistemic closure, is this failure to deal with underlying realities and be able to confront them as they are and look at a wide range of sources and data to evaluate that. And critically, and I've written about this, you have to evaluate arguments on the basis of logic and evidence. Once you get outside of that protocol, nothing but bad things happen. And that's clearly what's happened on a good chunk of the left. Because if your first way of evaluating an argument is the ascriptive characteristics of the arguer, or what was the source of what you referred to? Was it one of the good people or one of the bad people? This takes you out of the realm of logic and evidence and into essentially policing people's views and keeping them sort of down on the farm within that epistemic closure. So, yes, I totally agree that this is an overarching, the uber sin of the left that in some ways drives all the others.
Right. And in the identity politics section of your essay, you talk a little bit about, and I experienced this, being university educated in a left-wing university. I guess in linguistics, they call it code switching, like the ability to speak, for lack of a better term, maybe wokealese. And how alienating that is to non-college educated folks who, I even just use the word folks there, which is sort of a bit of code switching in and of itself, right?
Spell it with an X, Chris.
With an X.
Spell it with an X, yeah.
But the ways in which that alienates. The other thing that strikes me as well, just about the discourse, is because of this tendency now towards deplatforming and not actually engaging in debate and rhetoric. I recently prepared for a public debate, and it was fascinating just zooming out and studying the purpose of studying rhetoric, learning how to form arguments, learning how to listen to other arguments, deconstructing them. That skill set, I feel, is really, really falling apart, particularly on campuses and amongst maybe the younger elements of the left. But that commentary aside, I feel like we've sort of touched on the identity politics side of it. The second deadly sin is that of retro socialism. Can you sum that up for us?
Yeah, retro socialism, as I think of it and was arguing about, is not so much. It must be differentiated from social democracy, which is the idea that parties to the left should regulate the market economy, should promote the safety net, should promote prosperity for all, and that there's, untrammeled capitalism is not going to work very well. So we do need to have, approach the political economy in a way that does have a strong role for government, that does have a role for everything from industrial policy to, healthcare, socialized healthcare. These are all good things, but retro socialism kind of gets into the idea that the real solution, comrade, to the problems of our capitalist society, this dystopian hellhole we call America, is to completely get rid of the market, socialize everything, and basically implement an economic system where decisions are no longer sort of in control of the market. We decommodify everything. I mean, basically, it's a species of utopianism that goes back, many, many, many years in the sort of left of center movements. There's always been debates between utopians and sort of hardcore Marxists and social democrats and more practically oriented people who actually don't think you can have anything remotely like a centrally planned economy. And remotely, you can't sort of by some magic get rid of the market system and replace it with some elaborate system of workers' control and social expropriation. So the extent to which democratic socialists are sort of promoting that model, they actually are basically takes them away from having a more pragmatic, realistic approach to economic policy, toward reaching working class voters and convincing them doing such and such would actually be a good idea and would work, because essentially you're opposing as your reform, quote unquote, basically fundamentally transforming the system into something completely and radically different. Which, here's a little secret, Chris, people aren't really interested in that. They actually don't want a radical transformation of the system. They want their lives to be better, and they want political parties and government to play a role in making that happen. But they are not at all interested in a rapid transformation of the economic system into something completely different. And the extent to which people on the left become associated with that is a bad thing. And I think the Democrats have become more associated with that than they were, at least for a number of years, because of the rise of the Democratic Socialists and other left-wing activists within the Democratic Party, because many of these people do, in fact, subscribe to not only a radical transformation of the system, but their commitment to a radical transformation of the system pushes them in the direction of being committed to unrealistic policy goals, which makes it hard to sell sort of a more pragmatic left program to people.
It was interesting, Bernie Sanders, who I think, if you zoom out and look at him from a global context, is, basically a Scandinavian or European social democrat, labeling himself as a democratic socialist, which, given, the Cold War basis by which a lot of, older Americans perhaps see the world, perhaps isn't the best way to describe oneself. If you're trying to create like a broad tent electoral coalition, it struck me as a little bit puzzling. But this idea of the need for a radical transformation, I mean, according to, I guess, and I'm going out on a limb here in terms of my actual knowledge base, but this sort of historical determinism of Marxism, which is basically saying that the contradictions of capitalism are inevitably going to lead to this, socialist transformation, that sort of failed to materialize as the West outcompeted the Soviet Union, and as there was a compromise, I guess, between capital and labor, which raised the living standards of the middle class, and I guess resulted in this labor aristocracy, which I think the New Left became quite frustrated with. This transformation was not occurring because, hey, things are pretty great. I've got 2 cars in the driveway. I've got a house or a roof over my head, and I own it. I can send my kids to college. Those are pretty good times in the post-war period. And is this the point at which we start to move the left towards more of the environmental movement and a new form of sort of catastrophism, which is going to motivate this inevitable transformation as we reach the limits to growth and things like that? Do you read that in that light? Because I'm curious. There's certainly a tension between labor and the environmental movement, but the kind of new left or the left elite or the elites of the Democratic Party are quite embedded within the environmental movement. And I'm curious, maybe we're veering slightly off the 5 deadly sins here, but I think this is worthwhile. I'm curious your understanding of this kind of symbiotic relationship between the left elite or the new left and the environmental movement.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good point and an interesting way of looking at it. I mean, if you look at the broad history of Marxism and the left. I mean, the original view of Marx was that the contradictions of capitalism were going to inevitably produce the immiseration of the proletariat and unresolvable crises that would inevitably or likely lead to the introduction of socialism as a solution to those contradictions. Now, when Marx was writing Capital, it was ironically at the time when capitalism was finally starting to lift living standards and actually produce a better life for the working class. And as a result, the socialist parties that grew up around the ideas of Marx frequently sort of found themselves veering toward reformism to try to take advantage of the fact that things were actually getting better for the working class. And there was a certain amount of room to move in increasingly democratic capitalist societies. And over time, this really dominated the left with a little bit of a detour, at least the Western left, into communism. But communism took root in not advanced societies and became essentially a route to forced modernization. But that idea that capitalism had these innate contradictions that would lead to a vast transformation of the system into something totally groovy, I do think sort of lost its compelling logic as something based on economic contradictions per se. I mean, you could still see it in the way a lot of people on the left dealt with the slowdown in economic growth and rise in inequality after the 70s. They kind of made it into a sort of immiseration of the proletariat redux, which actually wasn't true. There had been a slowdown in growth in family income, an increase in inequality, et cetera. But it was actually not the case that people were being immiserated. It was just they weren't going up at the rate they used to, and there are all kinds of other problems that have evolved in these societies. But it really wasn't. We weren't going back to the England of the 1840s. That wasn't happening. But I think what has taken its place, and this is what you're getting at, is that when people think about the contradictions of capitalism today and how it might midwife a completely different system, they're not thinking about the immiseration of the proletariat. They're thinking about the way capitalism and growth are ruining the planet and will produce an inevitable catastrophe that may indeed extinguish, Chris, the human race as a race. I mean, this is really the conceit. Naomi Klein, I think, wrote a book, I forget its name, but
This Changes Everything. Yeah.
Yeah, This Changes Everything. So, she's she's clearly, quite leftist, and I'm sure has read her Marx, but I think this is the current stance of a lot of people on the left. It's not so much that the proletariat will be driven to ruin, it's just the planet will be driven to ruin. And the only way to stop this, comrades, is for us to radically transform capitalism into sort of eco-socialism. And that will allow us to live in peace and harmony.
And essentially impose austerity. We had Emmett Penny on recently to talk about the Andreas Malm inspired movie, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. But Andreas Malm talks about the ideal political system to overcome the climate crisis being war communism, referencing that rather dark period right after the Russian Revolution where there was extreme austerity and rationing. It's odd.
Don't forget all the people who were killed by the Cheka too. So hopefully that will be a part of his.
Well, there needs to be a great cleansing of any kind of opposition to this program.
Absolutely,
I guess
comrade.
it's it's dark, but I mean this is certainly I guess in a more organic way weaving us through these other themes of growth phobia and techno pessimism and catastrophism. But yeah, let's keep tugging on that thread of the left's marriage to the modern environmental movement and how that is putting them at odds with labor. It's interesting. Some of my comrades in the nuclear advocacy world, are pulling up some old pictures around the construction of Indian Point, where there were scuffles between environmentalists and workers involved in the construction of that plant. I think that was back in the 70s or 80s. But that carries on. Certainly in the struggle to save the Byron and Dresden nuclear plants in Illinois, there was that same kind of dynamic at play. between the environmental movement trying to shutter these plants and labor being at least friendly to the idea of nuclear, obviously quite job rich, and good quality jobs. So yeah, if we can explore a little bit more that entanglement of the new left with the environmental movement, I guess, whether the environmental movement has infected that new left and turned it away from its ideas, or just how you see that.
Actually, Chris, I wrote a sort of epic three-part series on this question for the Liberal Patriot called From Environmentalism to Climate Catastrophism, a Democratic Story, which has now been issued as an AEI working paper, nicely edited and all that jazz with sites and all that. So it's really interesting, I think, how the environmental movement became transmuted into, a catastrophist movement, essentially. But one thing that's interesting about that is the modern environmental movement, to some extent, owes its initial, inspiration and burst of activity to actually fairly catastrophist thinking. If you look at William Vogt, who wrote The Road to Survival in 1947, he was part of a school of people who were moving the American conservation movement, which was really about setting aside parts of nature so they wouldn't be despoiled by the market system, into a much more aggressive and sharp-edged kind of movement. I mean, Vogt basically thought, based on his experiences, that the nature of the market system and the way the planet was being developed would inevitably lead to catastrophe. It was just ruining everything. Chemicals were getting into everything. Ecological webs were being destroyed. The carrying capacity of the planet was being challenged. And you can really see how a lot of his ideas seeped into the early environmental movement. And in fact, Vogt was a friend and one of the people who inspired Rachel Carson's seminal book, Silent Spring, which is really the birth of the modern environmental movement in the United States. Now, if you actually read Silent Spring, I mean, it's a pretty catastrophist book in and of itself. I mean, it was basically saying chemicals were getting into everything. DDT was going to kill us all. Our bodily fluids were being polluted by these chemicals. And eventually,
interestingly, Rachel Carson's bodily fluids were being polluted by chemicals. She was getting chemotherapy for breast cancer while she wrote the book.
Wow,
it's an interesting little anecdote. But sorry for the interruption.
Little anecdote. So yeah, I mean, that's why it was called Silent Spring. It would get so bad that the birds wouldn't sing. So this hit the middle brow audience in the United States like a bombshell. But really, at this point, it's all about air and water pollution. It's about stuff. The world in which we live becoming polluted with all kinds of bad stuff. It was going to be bad for animals. It was going to be bad for us. The famous Tom Lehrer song about pollution. Where you can brush with the latest toothpaste and then rinse your mouth with industrial waste. I mean, it's a great song. Everybody should listen to it. But that's what people were thinking about and worrying about. And this drove the initial burst of activity in the 60s and early 70s, which was really about cleaning up the environment. That was the original environmental movement. Even though it sort of had these catastrophist ancestors, the actual political manifestation of that environmental concern was a burst of reformist legislation around basically the water and the air in particular. And then eventually we had the NEPA rules, which we can talk about some other time perhaps. But it clearly, a lot of stuff happened in a short period of time. And over time, it seems like the case is pretty strong that it worked, where they really did clean up the air and water to a large extent, and the country became less polluted, the air became less polluted. It was a good thing. But, and this gets to your example about the nuclear thing, you get to the 1970s, after this burst of activity, and the environmental movement is kind of looking around for something more to do. And you had the energy crisis, and then you had people like Amory Lovins talking about the soft path to the righteous society, which would be anti-nuclear and rely on renewables. Because concomitant with in this area, we do in the late 60s, 70s, 80s have the build out of nuclear in the United States, and this became a cause célèbre among environmentalists in a very short period of time. The environmental movement and environmentalists went from being, hey, let's clean up the air and water, to, hey, let's stop the nukes. And so at a certain point, they really became coterminous. A lot of the environmental organizations signed on to anti-nuclear activity and policy positions. And in a short period of time, you collapse, environmentalism and the anti-nuclear movement. They really become one and the same.
Which paradoxically worsens air quality with coal plants being built instead of nuclear plants. But anyway, that's an aside.
Right. That's another story. But I mean what was the motivation for that? Right. This gets us back to catastrophism, because the motivation for doing this was, no question about it, had basically preying on the public fear of nuclear bombs, nuclear explosions, nuclear bad, right? I mean, unleashing the atom is not good for humankind. It will destroy us all. So it became very easy to convince people that to build more nuclear plants is to simply leave yourself open to catastrophic meltdowns. Nuclear waste would lie around forever, and make sure your children had two heads and stuff like that. And then in '79, of course, you had the 3 Mile Island accident, which of course it didn't kill anybody, but it did completely freak people out. And at the very same time, as you know, the China Syndrome came out, the big film with Jane Fonda, and that really pushed a lot of the sentiment over the top. And at that point, the anti-nuclear movement really had the wind in its sails. And I think to the detriment of the American public, it actually became wildly successful. And over time, we found that through a variety of policy and regulatory movements and political interventions, it became essentially impossible to build nuclear.
Because I really view anti-nuclearism as underlying this desperate attempt to basically do anything but nuclear to respond to the climate crisis, and to embrace the preposterous idea that we can run a modern industrial society on weather-dependent resources. And it's interesting because, getting back maybe to the identity politics thing, it's renewables are the sacred cow, which must not be critiqued, and it's almost like they're a distinct identity group that are almost vulnerable and must be protected from any form of criticism. I guess to criticize renewables in a world in which nuclear is not available is basically to accept climate catastrophe. Maybe that's the kind of correct framing, but this ultra sensitivity to pointing out the very worrisome flaws with a renewable-centric energy transition really earns you the ire of many on the progressive left. I think that's kind of an interesting phenomenon.
Well,
I do
absolutely.
want to
I mean, Chris, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I have a book coming out with John Judas called "Where Have All the Democrats Gone?" And part of what we do in the book is we sort of argue that cultural radicalism has had a huge influence on the evolution of the Democratic Party and its alienation from the working class and its overall political electoral problems. And we talk about, in terms of that cultural radicalism, we talk about race, we talk about immigration, we talk about gender ideology, but we have a whole chapter on climate, because we really do think that, I do think that climate has become part of cultural radicalism, because it is part of an almost ideology or philosophy of the educated, college-educated liberals who basically dominate the Democratic Party. This is part of their faith. This is part of their worldview, or their Weltanschauung. I mean, they do see renewables as you say, this sacred cow that must be protected, and that if we just allow the cow to roam and feed it a lot, it will deliver the beautiful world we all want to live in. I mean, of course, you and I know that's preposterous, but that's what they believe. And back to epistemic closure, they don't want people raising too many questions about this. They just don't. So, I do think it's become part of this panoply of culturally tinged issues that form part of the world outlook of this group that now dominates left-wing parties. I imagine in Canada too. I'm sure in Canada too, and definitely in the United States. And you just questioning it is not allowed, and breaking out of and raising fundamental questions about whether this makes any sense. And why did we go off the nuclear path? Was this really a good idea? It doesn't get you much love in progressive left circles.
Well, and the kind of decarbonization policies that are being pursued, I've started to refer to them as boutique decarbonization. Things like, EV incentives, for cars that only the ultra rich can afford, usually as a second or third vehicle. The feed-in tariffs, where affluent families can be rewarded for making a $30,000-$40,000 investment. Maybe it's cheaper now in putting rooftop solar on and getting paid a premium rate, which is of course funded by non-homeowners in a very regressive manner. Um, it's interesting, rather than the big public works projects, which actually underlie the ability to electrify with low carbon energy, those legacy projects of potentially the TVA, or here in Canada, our nuclear build out, or the James Bay Hydro project. I mean, these are what would seem to me to be the obvious solutions of the left to try and bring back those kind of policies. I mean, building mega projects is hard. I get why politicians shy away from that. There's risk to that. But one would think those would be the logical policies, certainly of maybe perhaps the old left, or the pre new left. I don't know. The pre new left's pretty awkward phrasing, but do you hear what I'm saying in terms of that boutique decarbonization narrative?
Well, let me play the devil's advocate here, Chris. I mean, I think what people might say, who are a little bit more left wing than we are, listening to this conversation, might say, "Wait a minute, we are building nuclear now. We are, look at the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. There was, support for nuclear. There are at least a few, plants being built. It's more of an all of the above strategy. So what are you complaining about? Do you get the same thing in Canada where people say, "Wait, we are doing some stuff on nuclear. Why don't you just shut up and get with the program?"
Well, people certainly, say in my advocacy, I shouldn't poke any holes in the renewables narrative. This kind of nice non-conflict based, all of the above approach. And I bring that back to this question of, well, what are our goals? And in terms of obviously deep and effective decarbonization, we have a proven track record with large hydro and nuclear. But beyond that, in terms of my leftist commitments, to the role of labor to temper capitalism, to temper extreme accumulation and inequality. Unions are imperfect, but they do play, I think, that vital role. And the winning of just working conditions. I mean, I think a lot of that, as we saw in some of the legislation advanced in Illinois at the time of the Bayern and Dresden plants, and a lot of the academic just transition discourse is one in which, well, we will just mandate unionization in these renewables jobs, or we'll mandate prevailing wages, with a total ignorance, which I think is shameful for leftists to have this blind spot to the idea that just working conditions, just wages, worker safety, that was achieved through struggle. And it was achieved basically through the right to strike and the threat to strike. And with workerless facilities like wind and solar farms, where the jobs are only really in the construction phase and they're low skilled, they're transitory, they're delocalized. One does not have worker power in order to be able to make those demands for higher wages, which lie at the basis of not just a just transition, but just a just working place to begin with. So, that's how I end up pushing back. From a left
Also, it's a
perspective.
relative weight question, isn't it? I mean, at least that's how I sometimes address it. I mean, it's fine that there is some support for nuclear, but if you look at the relative weight of nuclear within the basket of incentives and policies that are being pushed in countries like the U.S. and Canada, I mean, it's pretty far. Nuclear is pretty far down the list. Renewables are, numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? So I think that's, that's a huge part of the problem, right? And the electric vehicles thing is interesting, I think, right? Because I think we probably agree that, the idea that we're going to really rapidly move toward replacing, ICE vehicles with electric vehicles, and everybody's going to be totally delighted with this, is pretty fanciful. But I think what people tend to say in the United States is, well, okay, let's leave that aside. But look at all the electric vehicle plants that are coming into online. These will produce good jobs for honest, hardworking Americans. How can you not like that? So, which then raises a question, I suppose, is to what extent, though we can't see it now, is this a viable? I mean, really, it's sort of a whole economic strategy, right? We're going to rebuild the American economy or whatever around this clean energy transition, part of which is rolling out electric vehicles. So I think it's kind of creates an interesting dynamic where, yeah, some jobs are being created in the short term and maybe in the medium term too, but how much potential does that have over the long term? How much is this really going to work out? If you bet a lot on electric vehicles and people don't wind up wanting to buy them very much, what happens to your strategy? Have you thought much about that? I think this is the kind of thing people are talking about here in the U.S.
For sure. I mean, it does seem like a bubble that has the potential to burst. I mean, we hear about every electric vehicle that Ford sells, they're losing $60,000. And obviously,
But they're making it up in volume,
there's an inertia phase to getting a new industry going, no doubt.
right?
But certainly, it's quite subsidy heavy at this point. Between our two large battery electric vehicle plants that we're setting up here in Ontario, the subsidies will amount to more than a year of Canadian military spending. So these are no small potatoes in terms of corporate subsidy. And for me, it's just I was at a climate town hall with my local MP, and the government refers to these as zero emission vehicles, and there's embodied emissions here. I think there's this kind of puritanical decarbonization at work, which folks like very astute energy analysts like Václav Smil push back against. There's no panacea. There's no easy way. If anyone ever tells you that it's going to be easy, that it's as simple as driving a so-called zero-emission vehicle, they're lying through their pants. Humanity is wedded to fossil fuels, and our disentanglement, if possible, will be extremely, extremely painful and not politically popular. So for me, it's this kind of tragic, like this whole. I think climate change is very important to act on, but it's an incredibly complex thing. It's a Gordian knot that's very, very difficult to untie, and again, will be quite painful to do so, particularly.
Sure, and it connects to the catastrophist stuff, right? Because if you truly believe that we are on the verge of a profound catastrophe, unless we move extremely fast, I think that sort of addles your thinking in so many different ways, right? It leads you away from the ground truths that Václav Smil has outlined so compellingly, just how hard it will be to move to industrial societies that are based much less on fossil fuels, and that this will take a long time. That's the thing I keep on coming back to in a way. Not just that it will be hard, we're talking about a lengthy period of time, realistically, to make anything remotely like this happen. But because people's thinking is so addled by the sense that, or the belief that we are on the verge of the precipice, that I think it doesn't lead you to very realistic thinking about policy and about economic transitions, right? I mean, because you think you have to do it now. There's no such thing as going too fast. And I think that this is really a fundamental part of the problem with why people can't think clearly about this stuff, because they are so bought into climate catastrophism, as opposed to understanding climate change as an ongoing issue that will take some time to deal with, kind of like, I think it was Ted Nordhaus who described it more as diabetes and a meteor hitting the Earth.
Right, for sure. And I mean, diabetes does have long-term complications. I'm no climate minimalist, but again, I think that this kind of war communism approach is not going to be politically popular, and indeed is driving a lot of working class voters, as I think you're documenting, away from the traditional parties of the left. I mean, what do you to what degree do you think that is a fundamental driver in terms of voting patterns? I guess your expertise is within the U.S.
Well, I think it's part and parcel of the evolution of parties to the left, including the Democratic Party of the United States, away from like a working class orientation and more toward the views of people who are educated and relatively affluent. I mean, this has been well documented by Thomas Piketty and his collaborators. You can see these cleavages happening everywhere in the advanced world. You see, basically, people can't see this on a podcast, but you basically got the most educated part of the population becoming increasingly democratic or leftist, and the working class, the least educated, becoming progressively more right wing and less left wing. So this is just a pattern everywhere, and I think the climate issue is part and parcel of that cultural economic divorce between the parties to the left and their traditional base. I mean, climate change is something everyone is at least somewhat concerned about. But the salience of that issue, and particularly the relationship of that issue to renewables, is much, much, much stronger against this increasingly strong and indeed hegemonic part of left-wing parties, which is their educated, relatively affluent, metropolitan, cosmopolitan supporters. This is what is salient to them. This is what's really important. And if the working class isn't on board with this, tough luck. We know this has to be done. And, these people, they just don't get it. They're behind the times. They're reactionary in so many ways. And this really is just our concern. So the tendency of parties to the left become much more responsive to the views of their new supporters and much less responsive to the views of their old supporters is not surprisingly driving old supporters away from the parties to the left toward other alternatives. I mean, how could it be otherwise? And I think nobody should be surprised at this.
It's interesting how quickly the times have changed. I think sort of my peak leftism was, and kind of a real moment of hope and what I perceived as opportunity was the pink tide washing over Latin America in the early 2000s. And that was largely based upon, this idea of resource nationalism, of reasserting control over natural resources, whether it was oil in Venezuela or natural gas in Bolivia, trying to escape from the Washington Consensus, develop regional autonomy, a multipolar world. But particularly that element of leveraging the fossil fuel resources of the country in order to develop the country. And all of the sort of national liberation movements in the post-colonial era were about trying to develop, not be austere. Maybe other than sort of the Khmer Rouge and sort of Pol Pot. but essentially, I mean,
Pol Pot.
And I mean, I've in France, I thought I was the genius who came up with the term Khmer vert. The French word vert being for green, but it is a term that's used in France. It makes sense in the French-speaking world that one would have been discovered before this humble thinker came up with it. But yeah, I mean, again, this idea, just 10, 15 years ago, which is quite popular, I think, amongst, certainly the radical left, of celebrating this example of, Venezuela or Bolivia leveraging their fossil fuel resources, taking them out of the grasp of the empire, getting value for them and investing in their social programs and in the development of their country. And now, 15 years later, that would be anathema, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating example, Chris, and I hadn't really thought about that, but it makes total sense. Before fossil fuels became so branded as being the tools of Satan, it was possible for people on the left to respond to political developments like that in less developed parts of the world and think, hey, this is pretty good. Just because it involves fossil fuels doesn't mean it's bad. But now I think we are more in a situation where anything that involves fossil fuels is bad. And I think the fact you bring this up in the context of the less developed world is important because, one of the most profound contradictions, arguably the most profound contradiction of today's clean energy left, renewables transition left, is that they seem to be completely unaware of the fact that most people in the world aren't as rich as the people in the countries in which they are pursuing this activism, and they need to develop. They need reliable energy supplies. And the idea that this can be done in these less developed parts of the world without, considerable fossil fuels and without building up an infrastructure that is not, in fact, just depend on weather-dependent renewables, I mean, it's utterly preposterous. So you're basically telling, the overwhelming majority of the world to cool it and don't worry so much about getting rich and moving into the middle class and having reliable energy. What's most important is we have to fight climate change, and therefore you need to forget about all this fossil fuel stuff and immediately build out wind and solar and all this stuff. I mean, it's absolutely staggering that people on the left would promote this retrogressive, anti, sort of poor people kind of thinking. I mean, it's gobsmacking in some ways, is it not? Do you think people are even aware of how idiotic they're being and how sort of, in a way, almost cruel?
Well, I think it points towards this loss of engineering discipline on the left. I've had Naomi Klein's brother Seth Klein on the podcast to talk about his book. I think it's called The Good War, and it's basically talking about how Canada really punched far above its weight in terms of war materiel production in World War II. You know, we started something like 34 crown corporations or state-owned enterprises, which banged out more motorized vehicles than the entire Axis powers. We had the third largest air force in terms of the number of airplanes. Absolutely extraordinary production. And he says, why can't we do this with windmills and solar panels? The only thing holding us back is this kind of conspiracy theory of capitalist elites and captured politicians rather than the thermodynamics of energy. So yeah, I think it has a lot to do with that loss of just understanding that it's would take an enormous amount of fossil fuels, and it did, to achieve that level of production, to produce that much steel, for instance.
That's a good point. Engineering discipline, that's a good phrase. I'll have to start using it, because it really is true. I mean, you read, the more you delve into the realities of the grid and what it takes to supply energy and the relationship of and ramping up renewables to this infrastructure and to these requirements, you even get down to, as our friend Robert Bryce writes about transformers. There are all these parts of the system that are extremely important, and their difficulties cannot be wished away.
And they're very hard to model in an Excel sheet or a more sophisticated software. These kind of bumps in the road, which are vital choking points.
And if we weren't in such a hurry to get to 100% renewables, or just stave off the climate catastrophe, we could think about these things, right? Because we wouldn't feel like we could basically have a gun to our head, and if we don't move incredibly fast, then we're all going to die. I mean, you could start thinking, well, okay, how do we actually do this? How can this be engineered? How can this really happen?
A panic is being sold to us as virtue when it comes to climate response. Maybe not the most level-headed position with which to examine the problem. There's this phrase I'm hearing more and more. The left would hate it because it's gendered, but this idea that hard times produce hard men create soft times, soft times create soft men, and soft men create hard times. I mean, I think we could definitely try and find a way to rephrase that'd be more inclusive. However, it does feel like we have exited the soft times period. And potentially leadership is starting to change as we enter into the new hard times cycle. Do you see any examples on the left that give you any hope whatsoever in sensible policy and politics emerging, really anywhere around the world?
Well, I mean, I think reality has bitten back, and sort of working class discontent has bitten back to some extent. We do see it sort of in American, intellectual left circles. There's much more of a realization of how difficult the energy transition will be. And certainly there's much more of a reconsideration of nuclear. And back to what I was talking about in the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, maybe the relative weight is off, but there is at least some recognition. Nuclear has to be part of the solution. And there may not, in fact, be as possible as we'd like to roll this out as fast as we'd like. And then I think there's some, fundamental realities of, say, EVs and how fast they're going to be adopted in the United States. If you're going to use a lot of wind and solar, what about the high voltage, long distance transmission lines? What about, how fast can they be built, and why can't they be built? Why can't nuclear be built? Why is it so damn hard to build stuff here in the United States anyway? Maybe that's a bad thing. So I think the evolution of, or the promulgation of what we call here in the US supply side progressivism, sometimes it's called the abundance agenda. There's a recognition that the system is not well adapted to producing the outcomes that we need to produce, both for a clean energy transition and for a lot of other stuff as well. And that leads to a bit more hard-headed thinking about, how can we get shit done? How can we actually provide energy for people? How can we make sure it's cheap and reliable? I think reality is starting to creep in. And when reality creeps in, politicians tend to respond a little bit. So, for example, you had Biden greenlighting the Willow Project. You had giving in the debt ceiling bill that was recently passed to actually change the permitting rules somewhat and to greenlight Mansion's Mountain Valley gas pipeline. So these are small steps, baby steps, I might say. But I do think that politicians are going to have to respond to the realities of what's going on with transforming the energy system, what works, what doesn't. And I think, isn't it Roger Pilkey's kind of like law, whenever a commitment to clean energy sort of clashes with a commitment to growth and reliable energy, growth and reliable energy will always win out, something like that, right? So I think politicians are increasingly going to be confronted with that choice. Either A, we press the accelerator and go down this path that's supposedly going to produce the green utopia, or B, we provide our citizens with reliable energy and economic growth. They will choose B. So I think that's what will produce, in the end, a better kind of and more sensible politics. I mean, you can look at Macron in France and some of the ways he's dealt with the energy questions. That's positive. I can't say much about Keir Starmer. We were talking about that before the pod started, and his Labour Party, about what they propose. They do seem to be all in on a pretty impractical approach to things. So I'd say there's grounds for optimism, but it's less because we see politicians doing like U-turns on this stuff, and more because they're starting to confront the realities of what they're trying to do, and that it's going to force them to take different approaches. That's what it would lead me to be optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think my own strategy in helping to kind of engineer a U-turn in our own federal politics back towards nuclear has been very much to try and drive a wedge between the elite environmental capture of the leadership of so-called progressive parties and labor. I mean, ultimately, getting back to this commitment to labor, will be the heroes of any kind of energy transition. They're the ones who are going to build it, and this is generally that sort of blue-collar, skilled labor folks who are going to lie at the heart of that in terms of, I think, being the choke point, being the rate-limiting step. And it's interesting, I'm making this analogy, and it may be a bit far off here or far-fetched, but in terms of the kind of demographic collapse, in terms of, learn to code rather than get your hands dirty as a pipe fitter or as a welder, we have seen a real collapse in the skilled trades. The average ages are, in their late 40s, early 50s. And I hearken back to the Black Plague. And how many the kind of European peasantry that was wiped out, and the relative political advantage that was gained just because of this constrained workforce, which again I think leads to more craft guilds and in some degree, some way, shape, or form. This is very kind of at the edge of my knowledge base. But I think we're going to see something very similar where, we're seeing it right in my local jurisdiction here, where as we talk about reshoring. Certainly, critical and strategic industries from places like China, where this multipolar world is emerging with some pretty serious geopolitical trends. We're seeing a reindustrialization and a reliance and a need on this, pretty vital group who I think will gain a lot of political power. And if they flex that muscle, we'll be able to impact policy, and hopefully there's ways to engage them to build real clean energy that benefits them and not the kind of rentier class and subsidy harvesters. That's kind of my own sort of political platform or manifesto there.
I 100% endorse the Chris Kiefer plan for building worker power and going toward a practical clean energy transition.
All right. Well, I think I like to end on that note. It's nice to end with an endorsement from Ruy Texeira. But a great conversation. I think we did circle back to the beginning and again the basis of our values. And again, I mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're both in favor of robust social services, a social safety net to prevent extreme poverty and the kind of just insult to humanity that are the faces of starving children and tattered clothes of the Great Depression, for instance, one of the great sort of contradiction moments of capitalism. But that these robust social services rely upon production. They rely upon the ability to extract, mine, refine, build things, generate wealth. And that it was interesting reading an article about Germany's recession as a result of their ridiculous energy planning. And that, yes, this is a very wealthy society with generous subsidies for even the arts and other things, but that those things are at risk if we undermine that underlying production, which the modern left has become so divorced from. So anyway, a little bit of a diatribe to end it. Roy,
Good
any
rant.
final thoughts? I hate me being the one to end there, so I'll give you the final word, Roy. Take it away.
Oh, I don't have any final word really, other than I'm in agreement with you. We're in a political situation where reality is starting to bite back, and I'd say people like us need to help that bite back and make it a little bit more painful, a little bit more obvious, so that people can move on to a different course, so will in fact benefit many more people and lead to a much better society over the long haul. In a way, we're trying to get the left back to its original purposes and commitments. It's really as simple as that.
Okay, final question that might be able to be a little less vague for you to answer. Ted Nordhaus and Michael Schellenberger wrote an essay that I think was really quite influential and shook a lot of environmentalists. It's called "The Death of Environmentalism."
Yes, yes.
Is there something needed that's similar to the death of? I don't want to say the death of the left. It means so many things to different people, and I don't want to offend people who hold the kind of values that potentially we hold. But are we in that kind of a moment where there needs to just be a radical transformation of these politics or a new politics emerging? Or does it just matter of reviving some of those old left values?
Well, I think, but they're really kind of the same thing in a way. I mean, there has to be in a sense, as you say, the death of the left as it's currently constituted, just like the death of environmentalism that Nordhaus and Schellenberger talked about. But that death and rebirth, to some extent, has to involve going back to the original commitments and priorities of the left. As John Judas and I put it in our forthcoming book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? You could do worse in looking back to the way the FDR and New Deal Democrats dealt with the questions of culture and of economic development. They were the party of the common man and woman, of the ordinary American, and that was their fundamental commitment. And they didn't have a particularly radical views on cultural issues. They were actually moderate to conservative on most things. And their commitment was first and foremost to, the forgotten American, to the sort of average person inhabited the society and whose needs needed to be attended to. And by reorienting the left toward that and away from fashionable boutique concerns about identitarian issues and about climate justice and what have you, I think the left can reinvent itself by taking advantage of its roots in the past and the fact that the currently existing offers from the left flat out don't work. So yes, I do think we need a sort of death of the left and a rebirth, but a rebirth that builds itself firmly on what made sense in the old left tradition.
Okay, Ruy, it's been great. It's been a slice. Thank you for making the time for Decouple.
Hey, it was fun.